The plain stretched wide and empty beneath a sky the color of faded denim, the horizon broken only by the jagged silhouette of distant mountains and the occasional wind-worn cottonwood. A rider moved slowly along the dirt road, his hat tipped low, his shoulders hunched as though the weight of the land itself pressed down upon him. He was a cowboy, the kind who had spent too many years working cattle under the sun and sleeping beneath the stars, a man who knew both silence and solitude better than most. His horse plodded along with a steady patience, the dust rising in small clouds around its hooves. For years, this cowboy had lived this way, carving out a life from sweat and grit. But as the seasons rolled on, he had come to know that a ranch and a herd were not enough to fill the hollow quiet of his nights. Loneliness, sharper than a branding iron, had settled deep inside him. It was loneliness that had finally pushed him to do what he once swore he never would. A letter, awkwardly written with calloused hands, had traveled eastward seeking a bride. Not just any bride, but a mail-order bride. Someone who might share the silence, someone who might soften the edges of his world. He told himself it was practical. Ranch work demanded 2 sets of hands, and a home was meant to be lived in by more than one. Yet deep down he knew it was not practicality that had driven him, but the hunger for human closeness, for a voice that was not his own echo. Word of his request had spread quietly among the small town folk who gathered at the general store or tipped their glasses in the saloon. They whispered about the cowboy who had sent for a wife, some chuckling, others shaking their heads, but all curious to see if the train from the east would truly deliver a woman into this hard land to stand by him. The cowboy kept to himself, pretending not to notice, though the thought of their eyes upon him made his chest tighten. Still, he told himself he could weather the talk. Better whispers in town than the endless silence at home. The weeks stretched into months. He worked his cattle, mended his fences, and rode the edges of his land, all the while picturing the woman who might soon arrive. He imagined her smaller than him, gentle, perhaps with a soft voice that could soothe his weariness. He pictured her carrying hope in her eyes, the kind of hope he once had but had long since buried. At night he would sit by the fire, staring into the flames, wondering if she would be afraid of this wide land, or if she might grow to love it as he had, through hardship and long patience. Finally, word came that the train would arrive. The cowboy prepared as best he could. He cleaned his boots until the leather shone faintly, trimmed the roughness from his beard, and even laid a quilt across the bed in the cabin that had not seen a woman's hand since his mother passed. He did not tell the neighbors, though he suspected they already knew. On the morning the whistle echoed across the valley, he saddled his horse and rode into town, his heart heavy with something that felt half like dread and half like yearning. The station was alive with motion when he arrived. Men shouted as they hauled freight. Women gathered their parcels. Children ran beneath the wooden platform. The train hissed and steamed, a beast of iron that had carried lives across miles of wilderness. The cowboy stood apart, hat low, eyes fixed on the line of passengers stepping down. Each face he studied with a cautious hope. Each woman who passed made his chest tighten, until finally he saw her. She was nothing like what he had imagined, taller than him by a head, with shoulders broad and solid as though built by the land itself. She moved with a strength that turned heads. Her dress, simple and travel-worn, could not disguise the power in her frame. Her eyes, sharp and steady, searched the crowd as if she had already decided where she belonged. When she stepped fully onto the platform, the people around her seemed smaller, their whispers growing louder as they stole glances. The cowboy felt his mouth go dry. This was the woman who had answered his letter, the one who had traveled across states and rivers to stand here now. She was not the gentle picture he had painted in the quiet of his cabin. She was larger, fiercer, and undeniably present in a way that unsettled him. For a moment he wondered if he should turn away, pretend he had never written at all. But her eyes found his, holding them with a steady gaze that rooted him to the spot. The townsfolk leaned closer, curiosity painted plain on their faces. Some smirked, some frowned, but none dared speak above a whisper. The cowboy's heart pounded against his ribs as he stepped forward. His boots scuffed the platform, and the distance between them closed until only a few feet remained. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. She looked down at him, her expression unreadable, then shifted her suitcase in one hand with ease as though it weighed nothing at all. He realized then that this was no fragile dreamer come to be tamed by the harshness of the West. This was a woman who carried her own storms, who might match the land's raw power with her own. What she sought in answering his letter he could not yet tell, but one thing was certain: his life would not remain the same. The whistle of the train blew again, long and sharp, echoing across the valley. Passengers scattered, the platform clearing as the engine prepared to move on. Still, the cowboy and the woman stood facing each other, neither speaking, neither looking away. The space between them held more weight than the words of any letter could carry. He felt the ground shift beneath his feet, not from the rumble of the departing train, but from the truth settling in. Whatever future lay ahead was no longer his alone to shape. And in that silence, just before he found the courage to speak her name, the station fell into a hush. The onlookers watched, waiting, their whispers hanging like smoke in the cool air. The cowboy's throat tightened. Would she accept the life he had promised in his letter? Or had she come for something entirely different? The answer lingered just beyond reach, hanging like a storm on the horizon. The cowboy stood rooted in place, his fingers twitching against the brim of his hat, as though the simple act of tipping it might bridge the heavy silence. The woman before him did not flinch, did not fidget, did not glance nervously at the crowd as others might have. She held her ground like someone used to being watched, her chin high and her eyes steady, scanning him as if weighing whether he could bear the life he had promised in his letter. Around them the town carried on in muted tones, but the cowboy felt as if the entire world had narrowed to this patch of platform, this meeting between two strangers tied together by ink and paper. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words stuck. In the quiet that stretched between them, he thought back to the night he had written his letter. He had sat at the rough wooden table in his cabin, the firelight dancing across the page, stumbling over every line. He had confessed his loneliness, spoken of the long winters, the endless work, and his need for someone willing to share a life built not on ease but on endurance. He had imagined the letter reaching a modest woman somewhere far away, one who dreamed of a home and warmth, who would welcome his hard land as an escape from crowded cities. Never had he imagined someone like her. The woman finally spoke, her voice carrying clearly despite its low tone. There was no softness in it, but there was no cruelty either. It was the kind of voice that belonged to someone who had worked as hard as any man, someone who had lived through storms and losses and still stood tall. "You're the one who wrote the letter?" she asked, though her eyes told him she already knew the answer. He swallowed, nodded once, and managed to say, "Yes, ma'am." His voice came out rougher than he intended, and a few of the townsfolk behind him exchanged smirks. He ignored them. The woman shifted her suitcase to the other hand, the muscles in her arms flexing beneath the fabric of her sleeve. She looked around the platform briefly, then back at him. "Then I reckon we've got things to talk about." It was not exactly the welcome he had pictured, but he nodded again and offered to take her bag. She handed it over without hesitation, and he was surprised at the weight of it, surprised too by how easily she had carried it herself. He motioned toward his horse tied near the hitching post, aware of every eye following them as they walked. The ride out of town was a quiet one. The woman sat behind him, her presence impossible to ignore, her posture upright, unbending. The cowboy found himself glancing over his shoulder more than once, not because he doubted she could ride, but because he could feel the weight of her silence pressing down on him. He wanted to ask her questions, where she came from, why she had chosen his letter, what she truly sought. But each time he opened his mouth, the words faltered and died. The land stretched out around them, vast and unyielding. The grasses bent in the wind, and the mountains in the distance seemed closer than they had that morning. He thought of how she must see it, this raw country. To him it was both home and burden, a place that had shaped him through hardship and long days in the saddle. To her it must look like another kind of wilderness, one that demanded as much from her as it had from him. When they reached the cabin, he felt the sting of self-consciousness for the first time in years. The small house of weathered wood stood alone against the open range, smoke barely rising from the chimney where he had left a fire burning. The barn leaned slightly under the strain of time, and the corral held a few cattle lowing in the dusk. It was not much, but it was all he had. He dismounted and helped her down, though she hardly seemed to need the hand. She looked over the cabin, her face unreadable, then met his gaze again. "This is it?" she asked, not mocking, just direct. "This is it," he answered, his voice steady though his stomach churned. Inside, the cabin was simple. A table, 2 chairs, a bed with the quilt he had laid out, and shelves lined with the few books he owned. She stepped inside without hesitation, set her case on the floor, and looked around. He waited, holding his hat in his hands, watching her as if the judgment of his life rested on her shoulders. She finally turned to him and said, "You live quiet." He nodded. "Quiet and steady. That's the way of it here." Her eyes softened, just slightly, though there was still a firmness to her expression. "I've lived with worse." That night they shared a meal of beans and bread at the small table. Conversation came in small pieces, not flowing but steady enough to carry meaning. He learned she had left behind a life of factory smoke and crowded streets, trading noise and confusion for the open air. She did not speak of family, and he did not ask. Sensing the silence there was deliberate. She did not laugh easily, but there was a calmness about her, the kind that came from a person who had learned to stand firm when the world tried to push them down. When the night grew colder, he offered her the bed and took the chair by the fire himself. She did not protest, though she watched him for a long moment before nodding. As he lay back in the hard chair, staring at the shadows flickering across the walls, he felt the unease settle deeper in his chest. She was here now, in his home, bound to him by little more than paper promises, and yet she was still a stranger. A stranger who might break the silence he had long carried, or deepen it beyond bearing. In the days that followed, the mystery of her presence grew rather than lessened. She took to the ranch work without hesitation, her size and strength turning heads whenever they rode into town together. She could lift what he could lift, ride as far as he could ride, and when she spoke, men listened, though some with narrowed eyes. The whispers in town grew louder, speculation feeding on every glance. Some said she was too much for him, others that he was a fool for thinking such a woman would stay. The cowboy heard the talk, but he held his tongue. At night, when the chores were done and the fire crackled in the hearth, he found himself studying her across the room. She would sit in silence, mending something or staring out the window at the moonlit fields. He wanted to ask her what had driven her to leave behind her old world and step into his. He wanted to know what she saw when she looked at him, if she saw a partner, a husband, or simply a man who had offered her a way out. But each time the words rose in his throat, something in her steady gaze kept him silent. The unease between them was not anger, nor was it distance. It was something heavier, something that felt like waiting. She was not a woman who rushed to fill silence with idle talk, and he was not a man who could easily pry open another's heart. They worked side by side, ate side by side, lived under the same roof, but the truth of what bound them remained unspoken. And yet beneath it all, he felt a current of tension pulling stronger with each day. It was in the way the townsfolk watched them when they rode in for supplies. It was in the way her eyes sometimes lingered on him when she thought he wasn't looking. It was in the questions he carried, but could not bring himself to ask. The letter had started it, but the letter was not enough. Somewhere in the spaces, between their silences, a storm was gathering, and he could feel it pressing closer, waiting for the moment when it could no longer be ignored. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the land in red and gold, the cowboy stood outside the cabin, staring at the horizon. The woman stepped out beside him, her presence solid and sure. They watched the light fade together, neither speaking until finally she said quietly, "You don't know half of why I came." Her words hung in the cooling air, heavy with meaning, but she did not explain further. She only turned and went back inside, leaving him staring after her with a weight in his chest that felt heavier than the land itself. Whatever truth she carried, it was not yet his to know, and the silence between them deepened into something sharper than before. The cowboy could not shake her words from that evening. They followed him like a shadow, slipping into his thoughts as he worked the cattle, as he rode the fence lines, as he lay awake listening to the wind against the cabin walls. "You don't know half of why I came." The sentence echoed, heavy with secrets he could not yet name. He had expected hardship when she arrived, the awkwardness of two strangers forced to share a roof, but he had not expected the sharp edge of mystery that cut into every silence between them. She carried herself with a strength that unsettled him and fascinated him all at once. At dawn, she was already outside, hauling buckets of water or splitting wood with a swing of the axe that left him staring. She never asked for direction, never waited to be told what to do. Sometimes he found her walking the property at night, her tall frame outlined against the moonlight, as if she were searching for something the land had buried. When he asked once what she was looking for, she only answered, "Just learning the shape of things," and left it at that. The town had its own way of stirring the conflict. When the two of them rode in for supplies, whispers rolled through the crowd like wind through dry grass. The general store clerk was polite enough, but his eyes lingered too long, curiosity brimming. The blacksmith, a stout man with soot-stained hands, had muttered loud enough for others to hear, "Never thought I'd see the day when a cowboy was outmatched in his own home." Laughter followed, quick and sharp. The cowboy had clenched his fists, but held his tongue, unwilling to stoke the fire. Yet he could feel how the stares carved into him, and he wondered what she thought of it all. If the remarks bothered her, she never showed it. She faced the town as she faced the open range, with a calm certainty that revealed nothing. But the cowboy noticed the way her jaw tightened when certain men looked too long, the way her shoulders squared, as if daring someone to speak more boldly. It was not just the ranch or the marriage that bound them now. Something about her seemed to carry a history that trailed behind her, unseen but heavy. One evening as the sun dipped low, he found her sitting by the barn, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes. The steel whispered against the stone, a steady sound that made the hair on his arms rise. He hesitated before asking, "You learned that in the city?" She paused, met his eyes, and answered, "Not all lessons come from the city. Some come from surviving things people don't like to talk about." He did not press her, though the unease lingered. It was becoming clear that whatever had brought her west was more than just his letter. The conflict grew sharper in unexpected places. A month after her arrival, a storm tore across the land, breaking fence posts and scattering cattle into the hills. The cowboy and the woman spent 2 days and nights riding through mud and rain, dragging calves out of the creek bed, driving strays back into the corral. By the time the storm passed, both were soaked to the bone and caked in mud, but she had worked with a ferocity that startled him. He saw her wade chest-deep into water to save a calf, muscles straining as she hauled it up the bank. He tried to tell her she didn't need to push herself so hard, but she only snapped, "If it breathes, it's worth the fight." Her words lingered with him as much as her strength. What had she fought for before this land? What battles had carved that conviction into her bones? At night, when exhaustion dragged at his body, he found himself lying awake, listening to her steady breathing from across the cabin. He wanted to ask her the questions that burned in his chest, what she had left behind, what storms she carried, but the fear of breaking whatever fragile balance held between them kept him silent. Meanwhile, a subplot began to stir in town. A rancher named Holloway, who owned a stretch of land bordering the cowboy's range, had started making comments whenever they crossed paths. At first, they were simple barbs about the woman's size, half-jokes tossed with a cruel smile. But soon they turned into questions asked too loudly, about whether she was truly a wife or just another hand. The cowboy knew Holloway had long coveted his grazing land, and now it seemed he had found a new way to prod at him. The tension reached a peak when Holloway cornered the cowboy at the saloon one afternoon. With a sneer, he muttered, "Never thought I'd see the day when a man sent for a bride and got himself a bodyguard instead." The men at the bar chuckled, and though the cowboy's hand tightened on his glass, he held back. Fighting in a saloon would do nothing but feed Holloway's hunger for trouble. But when he told the woman later that night, she stared at him with an intensity that cut deeper than Holloway's words. "You think I can't hear what they say?" she asked. "You think I don't know what I look like to them?" "Saint." He tried to reassure her, but she turned away, her face shadowed. That night, the silence between them grew wider than the prairie itself. Still, she never showed weakness. If anything, she worked harder, her determination unyielding. Yet the cowboy began to notice the way her hand shook sometimes when she thought he wasn't looking, or how she would wake in the middle of the night and sit staring at the door, as if expecting someone to come through it. These moments, fleeting but real, told him that beneath her unshakable surface lay something fragile, something she fought to keep hidden. The mystery deepened further one afternoon when he found her in the loft of the barn, going through the old trunk where he kept tools and spare tack. She had set aside her suitcase and was sorting through her belongings, among them a folded piece of paper covered in writing. When she noticed him watching, she quickly tucked it away. He asked what it was, but she only replied, "Just something I keep close." Her tone ended the conversation, but the question burned in his mind. The days stretched into weeks, the unspoken questions growing heavier. He could feel himself torn between admiration for her strength and the unease of the secrets she carried. At times, when they worked side by side in silence, he felt a strange bond forming, something deeper than words. But then a glance, a comment, or a shadow across her face would remind him how little he truly knew. The main conflict was no longer just the whispers of the town or the barbs of a neighbor. It was the truth she guarded, the story she refused to tell, and the cowboy knew that until he uncovered it, the distance between them would remain. One night, after another long day of work, she stood by the fire with her back to him. The light flickered across her face, catching the tension in her jaw. He wanted to speak, to finally ask the questions that had burned holes in his silence. But before he could, she said, "You think you know me because I came here on your letter. But there are pieces of me you wouldn't want to know. Pieces that don't belong to this land." He stared at her, his chest tightening, the weight of her words pressing down like a storm cloud. She turned then, meeting his eyes, and for the first time he saw something unguarded in her expression. Fear, sharp and raw, hidden behind all her strength. Before he could step closer, before he could speak, she turned away again and walked to her room, closing the door softly behind her. The fire popped, the night stretched quiet, and the cowboy sat frozen, staring at the closed door. The tension had reached a point he could no longer ignore, and though he did not yet know what storm she carried inside her, he felt certain it would soon break across both their lives. The days grew shorter, and with them came a restlessness that neither the cowboy nor the woman could shake. The cattle grazed quietly on the open range. The chores were done as they always were. Yet the air around the cabin felt heavier than before. Every silence seemed charged, every glance filled with questions unasked. The cowboy had always known solitude, but now the silence that lingered between them carried a weight that made his chest tighten. He felt the nearness of something building, a storm waiting at the edge of the horizon. In town, the tension pressed harder. Holloway had not let up with his remarks, and each time the cowboy passed through the saloon or walked down the wooden boardwalk, he felt eyes following him. The talk was sharper now. Men muttered that he had no control of his home, that his bride was more man than woman, that it was only a matter of time before she left. The women whispered too, though their tones carried a mix of pity and curiosity. The cowboy tried to ignore it, but whispers have a way of seeping into a man's mind, gnawing at the places already worn thin. One evening, while loading supplies onto the wagon, he heard Holloway's voice from across the street, carrying loud enough for all to hear. "You can put a dress on a giant, but she'll never fit in this town." Laughter followed, sharp and cruel. The cowboy froze, his hand gripping the sack of flour so tightly the paper tore. Before he could respond, he caught sight of her, standing just behind him, her face calm but her eyes burning with something fierce. She did not speak, did not flinch, only climbed into the wagon with a steady grace. He followed, his stomach twisting with anger and shame. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, the wagon wheels rattling over the dirt road, the mountains dark against the sky. Finally he said, "You don't have to listen to them." Her voice was low, steady. I've been listening to men like that my whole life. Words don't cut me as deep as you think. But lies do. He glanced at her, confused. What lies? She looked straight ahead, the reins firm in her hands. The lie that this life is only about cattle and land. The lie that I came here only because of a letter. You don't know the truth of me. And until you do, their words will always have teeth. The cowboy wanted to press her, to demand the truth, but her tone left no room for questions. He rode the rest of the way in silence, the weight of her words pressing down harder than Holloway's laughter ever could. The unease only deepened in the following days. She began spending more time near the ridge at the edge of the property, standing there in the evenings, as if searching for something beyond the horizon. Sometimes she carried the folded paper he had seen before, clutched tight in her hand. Once, when he walked up beside her, she tucked it quickly into her pocket and turned away. At night, her restlessness grew sharper. He would wake to find her sitting by the door, staring out into the dark with her shoulders rigid. Once he asked her if she was afraid of something, and she answered only, "Afraid? No. Waiting, maybe." Then she turned her gaze back to the night, leaving him with more questions than before. Meanwhile, Holloway's pressure on the land grew bolder. The cowboy found broken fence posts near the boundary, tracks of cattle driven where they did not belong. He knew Holloway was testing him, waiting for a chance to push harder. When he mentioned it to the woman, her jaw tightened and she said, "Men like him don't stop until someone makes them." The way she spoke, it sent a chill through him, because it sounded less like a warning and more like a promise. The conflict between them and the outside world seemed to twist tighter with each day, but the greater battle still lay inside the cabin walls. The cowboy could feel it every time she looked at him with those steady eyes, every time her silence filled the air. He wanted to reach her, to understand her, but each attempt fell flat. She had built walls as strong as stone, and he feared he did not have the strength to climb them. One evening, after a long day of chasing strays, the two sat by the fire, their faces lit by the soft glow. He broke the silence at last. "I didn't bring you here for this. To be talked about, to be mocked. I brought you here because I needed someone who could share this life. I thought maybe you needed it too." She turned to him then, her eyes fierce, her voice sharper than he had ever heard it. "You think I came here because I needed saving? Because I needed your land or your name? I came because I needed a place where my past couldn't follow me. But it does. It always does." The cowboy stared at her, stunned. Her words cracked open the mystery he had long felt but never named. Yet before he could speak, she rose from her chair and walked outside, the door closing hard behind her. He sat frozen, listening to the wind whistling through the cracks, the fire snapping as if to echo the tension. The next day, trouble finally came knocking. While riding near the far boundary of the ranch, the cowboy spotted Holloway and two of his men driving cattle across his land. He spurred his horse forward, anger burning hot. Holloway greeted him with a smirk, tipping his hat. "Cattle don't know fences," he said, voice thick with mockery. The cowboy's hand went to the rope at his saddle, ready for a fight, but before he could act, the woman appeared. She rode up fast, her tall figure commanding even on horseback. Her voice cut through the air. "You're trespassing," Holloway sneered. "And what will you do about it?" "You don't scare me." The woman leaned forward in her saddle, her gaze sharp as a blade. "Then you've never met someone who doesn't bluff." The standoff hung heavy in the air, the cattle lowing nervously around them. The cowboy's heart pounded as he watched the two face each other, knowing one wrong move could ignite something that could not be undone. Finally, Holloway spat into the dirt and motioned for his men to turn the herd. "This isn't finished," he said, his eyes lingering on her before he rode off. The cowboy exhaled slowly, the weight of what had just passed settling deep. He looked at her, ready to thank her, but she rode past him without a word, her face set and unyielding. That night, the cabin felt colder than ever. She did not sit by the fire as usual, did not speak over supper. Instead, she kept to herself, her eyes distant, her hands restless. He wanted to reach for her, to ask her to share the truth she carried, but the words caught in his throat. The silence stretched long, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of coyotes in the distance. As the days wore on, the land seemed to mirror the turmoil between them. The winds blew harsher, the nights colder, and the cattle restless. Holloway lingered at the edges of their lives, a constant threat. But even more pressing was the storm within the cabin, the tension between the cowboy and the woman who shared his roof but not her secrets. Then, one night she finally spoke words that set his heart racing. She stood by the window, staring out at the moonlit fields, and said, "It's coming soon. The reason I'm here, the reason I can't rest. And when it does, you'll have to decide if you can stand with me or turn away." The cowboy rose from his chair, his pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" She turned then, her face shadowed, her eyes burning with a fire he had never seen before. "You'll know when it arrives." And with that she walked past him, her footsteps heavy against the wooden floor, leaving him staring at the darkened window with his chest tight and his mind racing. He knew then that whatever storm she carried, it was no longer just hers. It was his too, whether he was ready or not. The days ticked by with a sharpness that made every hour feel stretched. The cowboy could feel the climax of it all pressing closer, like thunder rolling just beyond the mountains. The cattle grew restless, the land grew colder, and Holloway circled nearer. Yet the greatest weight of all was the woman's silence, her secret that now felt poised to break open at any moment. Each night, as the wind howled across the plains and the fire burned low, he lay awake listening for her footsteps, waiting for the storm that she had promised. He did not know when it would strike, but he could feel it pressing closer, and he knew that when it did, nothing on this land would remain the same. Top of form, bottom of form.